having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America. Because I think today, what's going on in South America is amazingly significant. Viva los Latinos y las Latinas. Viva. 7 countries in South America representing over 80% of the population of South America, 300 million out of 360 million people in the last elections voted in the president who ran specifically on an anti-corporatocracy campaign. Yeah. Now, I want to tell you that these people are not anti-American. I speak Spanish fluently. I spend a lot of time in Latin America all the time. I have 3 godchildren who live in Latin America. I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer in the late 60s. And I can tell you that any one of you goes to any one of these 7 countries and the people there will welcome you with open arms. And they love what this country represents, despite what our president says about people hating democracy. I don't know anybody that does. They love our Declaration of Independence. They love our ideals. They hate having our corporations exploit their resources. They can't stand that. What Bolivia wants is not cocaine. That's an absurdity. What Bolivia wants is to have its natural gas be used, the revenues from its natural gas be used to help pull its poorest people up by their bootstraps. What Ecuador wants is for its oil to be used to help its poor people. That's what Venezuela wants. And Brazil wants to have its Amazon rainforest used to help its people and all of its other resources, and the same for Chile and Uruguay. All of these countries, what they are objecting to is the corporatocracy. It isn't you and me. It isn't the American way. They love this, but they can't stand to have their resources exploited by us. They're not asking us to help them. They're not asking for foreign aid. In fact, you know, Chavez just helped Bolivia pay off all of its debts to the IMF. It's nice to be with enthusiastic people. So they've sent us a very, very strong message, an incredibly strong message. I am so taken by what's going on in South America today, these democratic movements. And isn't it interesting that in our own country, in the United States of America, in recent history, the only people that have really organized and taken to the streets and protested have been the Latinos. They understand democracy. But I want to tell you what happens to these presidents in South America. And I can tell you this as a fact because after Confessions of an Economic Hitman was written, a lot of people came out of the shadows, other economic hitmen and jackals and others, and talked to me and told me their stories. And their stories are going in the book I'm working on now, as well as, they're pretty amazing. I kind of like some of my stories, but wait till you read theirs. Puts me to shame. And I talked to a couple of them who've done what I'm going to describe for you right now in the last few years. Every one of these presidents, when he's taken office, or she in the case of Chile, when he or she has taken office, someone like me, someone with my old job, economic hitman, walks into that office. And this is someone the president knows, seen around, maybe works for the World Bank or a private consulting firm. He's been around, he speaks Spanish, or she maybe. And that person walks into the president's office and says, "Mr. President," or Ms. President in the case of Bachelet of Chile. "So the president walks in and says, the economic hitman walks in and says, "Congratulations, Mr. President. And now, I just want to remind you that," and he speaks in a pretty soft voice at this point, "I just want to remind you that in this pocket over here, I got a couple of $100 million for you and your family. Couple of $100 million if you play the game our way. And in this pocket, I got a gun with a bullet. It's got your name on it in case you decide to keep your campaign promises." Every one of these presidents has had that experience. Chavez has been writing about it and speaking about it. He's read my book and invited me down there, and he's got some amazing speeches where he talks about the economic hitmen and the jackals that have come to him. In the case of Ecuador, Gutierrez was elected president. He ran on a very strong anti-oil campaign, anti-corporatocracy campaign, and the people, and I know Ecuador really well, that's where my godchildren are. And I was there at the time, and he won with a pretty good majority on this anti-corporatocracy platform. He was visited by one of these men, I know who, and within a month he was in Washington, D.C., and when he came back, people were plastering pictures up all over the walls of Quito and Guayaquil with pictures of Gutierrez holding hands with George Bush. George likes to hold hands with a lot of men. Have you noticed that? And he began to cut real sweet deals with the oil companies. And he began to implement the conditionalities that the IMF and the World Bank wanted him to pose upon his people. The people took to the streets. They were infuriated. They had elected this guy, and he's gone against his campaign promises, and they kicked him out. He had to flee to Brazil. Now, my phone was ringing off the hook that day. My Ecuadorian friends were calling me and saying, "You know, in a democratic country like Ecuador, when you vote a man in who runs on a certain campaign platform, and he doesn't keep it, he goes against everything he ran on, democracy demands that you throw him out of office." Why don't you guys do the same thing? I don't know, I said, maybe we're not a democracy. So, all over South America, this is what's going on now, and we're seeing the repercussions in many countries, actually. And what I want to say to you is, put yourself in the position of that president. Imagine if you had run on a campaign that you deeply believe in, of keeping down the corporatocracy, of using your country's resources to help your people, and you're voted in, and somebody walks into your office and says something like that to you. Now, that's usually said more subtly. It's not quite as dramatic as I put it, but because I've said that to people like that. And what we really say at that point is, hey, remember what happened to Arbenz of Guatemala? Remember what happened to Allende of Chile? Remember what happened to Roldos? Remember what happened to Lumumba in the Congo? Remember what happened to Diem in Vietnam? Remember what happened to Torrijos? Remember what happened to Noriega? Remember, remember, remember. They get the message. What would you do if you'd just been elected president of one of these countries and someone like me walks into your office and gives you this ultimatum? Here's a lot of money for you and your family, or we can throw you out of office. And you know damn well that if you get thrown out of office or assassinated, the next guy is going to be scared shitless. What's he going to do? So what are you going to do when that happens? What would you do? It's a hard question to answer, isn't it? So what has to happen here is it's you and me who have to do something. It's us here in this country. We can't let that happen anymore. We must defend democracy. And even if we don't like what those democratically elected presidents are saying, and I don't like what some of them are saying, I'm not a real big fan of some of those presidents and their economic policies, I got to tell you that. But I 100% support them as long as they're elected democratically. And most every one of them has been elected by a much greater majority with a much greater percentage of their population voting than happened in this country. They are truly democratically elected presidents. And I don't care what CNN says about, or Fox or anybody else about Chavez. He has won plurality after vote. He keeps winning. And so we must send a message to our government and to our corporations, to the corporatocracy, that they have to respect democracy. Not just any president, whether he's a democratically elected president or a dictator who happens to support our corporate policies. We must stand behind our principles. One of the other things that's happened in the history of this country during my lifetime, as we've built this empire, is that we have managed to subjugate, to put aside, to sweep under the rug every principle that I grew up believing was what makes America great. And we need to turn that around. The very things that you all joined the military to fight to support, we've managed to subjugate, and we need to change that. So let's talk about how we can do that. Let's move on to the good news. And again, the good news is we know we live on a very, very small planet. We know we have all the resources we need to make this a better world, and that the only way our children are going to grow up safe, secure, and in a sustainable world is that if every child in the world has that opportunity. Right now, we represent 5% of the world's population. We consume over 25% of its resources and create more than 30% of its pollution. And the only thing you can say about a system like that is it is a failure. You cannot take that system to India or China or Africa or South America. It doesn't work. Do the math. 5% of the world's population consuming 25% of its resources and contributing over 30% of its pollution. That is a failed system. We have to change it. We know from history that empires never survive. They always collapse. And when they collapse, a void is created. And more wars happen, and then a new empire emerges, which usually isn't any better than the last and could be an awful lot worse. I sure don't want to see my daughter have to wear a veil. I'm not looking to have the Chinese run my country or anybody else. What we must do this time is something that's never been done in history before. We must turn this empire into something new, something different. We must create a new model. So let's not watch the empire collapse. Let's instead transform it. Let's transform it into something that represents the ideals that our founding fathers envisioned when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and that so many men and women over the centuries have died for in defending. So many of your brothers and sisters in the military have died to defend those principles. So let's turn this country into something that truly represents those principles and take that out to the world as a model. The way we can do this, and the way we must do this, is to go after the power base of the corporatocracy. Please continue working in politics, those of you who do. Continue moving in that avenue, but recognize that unless we change these corporations, that only has some limited benefits. If we want to really change the system, we've got to go after the emperor. And the emperor is not in politics. The emperor is controlling the money. That's the big corporations. These corporations today have one goal. And that goal is to make a few rich men a lot richer. We need to change that so that the goal now becomes one of primarily serving all the employees even after retirement, through health benefits, etc. Serving their customers, of course. Serving their customers, and also serving the people who provide the raw materials that go into those corporations, whether those people live in Ethiopia or in Indonesia or in Uruguay. Taking care of the people that provide the resources and taking care of all the communities and the environments where all of these people live. In other words, these corporations need to become good citizens. They need to become good moral communities. They are our main communities. Most of us look at a globe of the earth and we see all these countries outlined on it, about 200 of them, slightly less, and many of those countries were created by us, by the colonial powers, sort of arbitrarily. But most of those countries don't really impact any other countries, with some obvious exceptions like us. But most of them don't impact other countries. And in any case, thinking of that globe as the geopolitics of this planet is archaic. The real geopolitics of this planet could better be viewed as a bunch of huge clouds that move around this planet, and those clouds are the big corporations. And they really run the geopolitics of this planet. Of the 100 largest economies in the world, 51 are corporations, not governments, and 47 of those are US based. These are the entities that control the planet. And so we must change those corporations. We must bring them around. They will tell you, and all of our governments will tell you, that every country out there that we're working with ought to be a democracy and ought to be transparent. And I think that's a pretty good idea. But what about the corporations? Every corporation should be democratic and transparent. What we have today is what I call imperialistic capitalism, where a few men make all the decisions and most all the money. What we need to move into is democratic capitalism, which will be much more egalitarian, which in fact represents what our Declaration of Independence called upon. One of the reasons I wanted to be here tonight with you is because I know what incredibly active group you are. And that's what we need, an active group like this to lead the way. We need to transform these corporations. And I know some of you are thinking right now, you're out there, you're saying, but that's too tough. We can't transform the corporations. They're too powerful. They're too strong. They're too big. But the fact of the matter is, they are extremely vulnerable, and they are extremely easy to bring around. And I can cite you so many examples. Just think about, well, when I went to Boston University, the Charles River, you couldn't walk beside of it because it stank so badly. And there were rivers in the Midwest of this country that were on fire with pollution. Those were all corporations that did it, and it was corporations that cleaned it up. Not because they decided they wanted to, but because we told them they had to. And the corporations were destroying the ozone layer with aerosol cans and other types of chemical pollutants. That's changed. We reversed that. And we brought about much more egalitarian policies in corporations regarding race and gender issues. We've had tremendous impact on corporations whenever we've decided that that's what we wanted to do. We need to now use those same techniques to change the basic premise of the corporation so it transforms itself from an imperialistic organization to a democratic one. So it transforms itself from, instead of a place that makes a lot of money for a few people, to take care of its employees and its customers and those who supply the raw materials. I'd like to tell you a little story. One of my I do a lot of work with organizations. I used to do a lot of work, we call something called Shape-Shifting the Corporation, and that was through a nonprofit called Dream Change. You can see it at dreamchange.org if you're interested. But one of my favorite organizations is Rainforest Action Network, RAN. RAN has managed to change the policies of huge corporations as they relate to cutting old growth and rainforest trees. They have changed Boise Cascade, huge organization. They have changed Home Depot and Kinko's. They have changed Citicorp and Goldman Sachs. They've had a tremendous influence on corporations. They do it all non-violently, but they're very creative. They demonstrate, they hang banners, they do all kinds of things. They have less than 40 employees, and they operate on a budget of less than $4 million, and they do amazing, amazing things. And not too long ago, there was a particular, they've also had a huge impact on Mitsubishi. Not long ago, there was a campaign where Rainforest Action Network was going after a huge corporation to get them to change their policies. And they were using all these techniques, and then it got very nasty and ugly between a senior vice president of this big corporation and the founder and then president of Rainforest Action Network, Randy Hayes. They locked horns. It got very, very nasty. In the end, Rainforest Action Network won. They've never lost a campaign. And this big international corporation signed the agreement with Rainforest Action Network that they would no longer cut old growth trees or rainforest trees. A few months after that agreement was signed, I had the good fortune of being at a conference in Santa Barbara, California with these two men attending, about 30 people, including these two men, the senior vice president and Randy Hayes. And on Saturday night, I ended up on this mountain overlooking the Pacific with an almost full moon rising, sitting in a hot tub with these two men, drinking beer, naked, feeling just a little vulnerable. These two guys, they've been nasty, you know, and I'm the only thing between them there. White bear. But as the night went on and we drank a little more beer, finally this senior vice president turned to Randy and he said, "Randy, I got to thank you. You know, I and a number of other executives at our corporation had wanted to do the right thing about rainforests for some time, but we didn't dare take it to our management. We were afraid we'd lose our jobs. We didn't dare take it to the stockholders. And then you came after us, and all your people went out on the streets and demonstrated, and finally it got right in the face of management. It was ugly and it was difficult, but it gave us the opportunity to force our company to do the right thing." And I got to tell you that across this country, there are many corporate CEOs and other executives who want to do the right thing. They are human beings. I know a lot of them personally. They have children, grandchildren, nephews and nieces. They know about Osama bin Laden. They know about Hugo Chavez. They know what's going on in Latin America. They know that the environment's being destroyed. They've seen the Al Gore movie. They know what's going on, probably better than a lot of the rest of us, and they're damn scared. But they don't know what to do. And so it's up to us to tell them what to do, to show them the right way, to do like Rainforest Action Network did, every one of us. And so I'm here tonight to say to you, you know, keep on going after King George and keep fighting to end that war in Iraq. We must do these things, but realize that in a way those are Band-Aids, and we must do them because we're hemorrhaging badly. We've got to get out of Iraq. We've got to, you know, change the policies of this country immediately, but we've also got to go after the root cause, the deep disease that's here. And that deep disease is that up until World War II, in my opinion, this country was moving in an amazing direction. And it was sometimes moving haltingly. Yes, we had the Declaration of Independence. We fought a glorious war against Britain and won it. And then we continued to kill off the Indians. And we kept the blacks enslaved. And we didn't give you women the right to vote until 1919, and so on and so forth. But we kept moving forward. making progress, little by little sometimes. It seems slow, but we kept making progress. And then after World War II, subversives took over. The corporatocracy took over, and they became extremely greedy. And they created an empire. And we have this empire today, and we're living under it. And we must change it. We simply must go out there and change it. And so I'm sure some of you are asking, but, you know, what do I do, me personally? Some of you may be saying, it's too big, it's too difficult. You know, it's one thing to talk about taking down a president. After all, we got an election coming up and not too many months away, so that seems achievable. Yeah, we can get rid of Bush, and let's put a Democrat in, but that's not going to solve the long-term problem. And if you're saying it's too big, it's too tough, it's too difficult, that's just a cop-out. What if George Washington and Tom Paine and Thomas Jefferson and Betsy Ross and all those other men and women had said, the British Empire, it's just too goddamn big and powerful, I can't do anything about it. And it was. It was the biggest, most powerful empire in the history of the world at the time, and it happened to be their government. Every one of those men and women would have been hanged as traitors, as terrorists, had they lost the revolution. But they did the right thing. And I often think that, thank God, my grandfather ran a small furniture business in New Hampshire in the 30s, 20s and 30s, and he made a lot of money. And when the Depression came along, there was a temptation there for him to use that money he'd made and go out and buy up local farms and businesses a penny on the dollar. But he said no. I hadn't been born at the time, and he didn't have grandchildren, but he said, if I'm ever going to have grandchildren and they're going to have a hope to live on this planet, I've got to help this whole community pull itself up by the bootstraps. And every other businessman in that small town in New Hampshire said the same thing. And they did it. Thank God my grandfather did the right thing. And my father could have said, Hitler? He's killing a few million people in Europe, mostly Jews. I'm not Jewish. I live in the United States. I'm safe. But he didn't say that. He was fairly old at the time. He didn't have to join the service. He could have gotten out of it. But he did. And he became head of an armed guard unit on oil tankers that traveled across the Atlantic, a very, very dangerous job in those days. And he ended Hitler's reign. Thank God he did that. Thank God those people had courage. Thank God you people, a lot of you, had the courage to join the military. Today, you know, we've got a lot of young men and women dying. I don't know how many died today. Someone out there knows, but I'm probably half a dozen today. Well, we've all now got to be willing to put our lives on the line if that's what it takes to change this thing. We've got to have that courage. We've got to have the same courage that our forefathers had, and that our parents had, and that many of you have had and exhibited in another way. We must have that courage. We must make whatever sacrifice is necessary for the sake of future generations, because that's what we're about. And for the sake of the past generations, I loved what Libby said about knowing that she lives here now, and that there's those before her, and that those will come after, and it's a constant struggle. We must do our part. I often think about what a selfish generation I grew up in. And I think I did. I think my parents worked very hard. They came up through the Depression and World War II to give me a good world, a good life. Seems as though my generation, for the most part, has said, well, you know, helping my children has given them a good education and making sure they find a good spouse and helping them find a good spouse and have good kids, and those kids get a good education, we get good TV and a good car and a good home. Well, we never thought about, what about the rest of the world? What about that community? For my grandfather, the community was a small town in New Hampshire, and if he could take care of that area, that was it. Today, the community is this planet, and we must take care of it. We must move forward with it. So each and every one of us has something incredible to contribute. And as I look at you who are in my generation or older, and I'd say my generation is the 30s and older. I don't know that I wish that anymore, you know. Anyway, we older folks, we truly are the elders. We've got so much to do. Most of us don't have bosses anymore, so we can't be fired. You know, what do we get to lose? We really must go out there and work with you younger folks, and you too must have the courage and be willing to make the sacrifices. But it is our time, we elders, to really lead the way. You guys are all here. Let's get rid of this president, and let's get rid of everybody that thinks like him. Let's end that war in Iraq, but let's also go out and change the corporatocracy. Having done a little bit on Saudi Arabia and Iraq, I want to talk a bit about South America. Because I think today, what's going on in South America is amazingly significant. Viva los latinos y las latinas. Viva. 7 countries in South America representing over 80% of the population of South America, 300 million here in the late 60s. And I can tell you that any one of you goes to any one of these 7 countries and the people there will welcome you with open arms. And they love what this country represents, despite what our president says about people hating democracy. I don't know anybody that does. They love our Declaration of Independence. They love our ideals. They hate having our corporations exploit their resources. They can't stand that. What Bolivia wants is not cocaine. That's an absurdity. What Bolivia wants is to have its natural gas be used, the revenues from its natural gas be used to help pull its poorest people up by their bootstraps. What Ecuador wants is for its oil to be used to help its poor people. That's what Venezuela wants. And Brazil wants to have its Amazon rainforest used to help its people and all of its other resources, and the same for Chile and Uruguay. All of these countries, what they are objecting to is the corporatocracy. It isn't you and me. It isn't the American way. Out of 360 million people in the last elections voted in the president who ran specifically on an anti-corporatocracy campaign. Now, I want to tell you that these people are not anti-American. I speak Spanish fluently. I spend a lot of time in Latin America all the time. I have 3 godchildren who live in Latin America. I was there as a Peace Corps volunteer. They love this, but they can't stand to have their resources exploited by us. They're not asking us to help them. They're not asking for foreign aid. In fact, you know, Chavez just helped Bolivia pay off all of its debts to the IMF. It's nice to be with enthusiastic people. So they've sent us a very, very strong